All right. Hello, everyone. It is 3:02 Eastern Time on my end, so I'm going to get us started here. My name is Tori Nagash, and I serve as the Research Initiatives Manager at ACUHO-I. And I'm excited to welcome you to today's Endorsed Research webinar, The Impact of Fixed Term versus Traditional Employment Contracts on Employees in Live-In, On-College, and University Housing and Residence Life Organizations. A significant focus of the ACUHO-I research agenda is to disseminate research about housing and residence life in the field, and endorsed research is one of the ways that we're able to achieve this. So ACUHO-I and the ACUHO-I Research Committee invite endorsed research applications for issues related to campus housing, including those that align with our research agenda priorities of public-private partnerships, student outcomes, and student success. If you're interested in applying or learning more, you can find information about endorsed research under Research and Data in the Knowledge Resources area of the ACUHO-I website. A few housekeeping notes before we start. The live transcript feature is enabled, so you should be able to turn on subtitles if you would need those during the webinar. Also, please feel free to post any questions you might have in the chat or hold them until the Q&A time at the end. I will be helping with fielding those, and so we'll make sure that your question is raised and answered during our time together. And with that, I will turn things over to our presenter.
Well, hi, everybody. Again, my name is Billzimmerman. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am currently the Assistant Director for Employer Engagement with the Career and Professional Development Center at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. However, prior to last June, when I took this role, I had been in housing and residence life for a little bit, if you count my undergrad experience, over 20 years. I've been involved with housing and residence life for a while, and I do miss it, and quite frankly, wouldn't mind getting back into it. And I'm going to share my screen here at this point, just so that way we have it ready to go here. But yeah, I do miss it. A little bit more about me. Like I said, I have been a full-time professional, and I'm making sure I get my right things here. I've been a professional for 17 plus years, worked most of the time at Indiana University of Pennsylvania as a live-in staff member. Also spent time at a small private institution near Philadelphia, Cabrini College, Cabrini University now, for those of you who might know that. But my experiences were at public and at private institutions. And as I was contemplating doing my doctoral work, again, the question came up of, okay, so Bill, what's your dissertation going to be on? What are you going to do? And I thought about a couple different topics. I thought about looking at union versus non-union employees, either in higher education or in residence life, but it didn't seem that there would be as much there. So what I did was started to look at, because I sat around to myself and I kind of wondered. I see myself and a lot of my colleagues in the state system of higher education. We tend to stick around in our positions for a long time. So I got around to thinking, well, why is that? And are there others like that? We hear often this five and out sort of thing with housing and residence life in particular. So basically, why do I stay? Why do my colleagues stay? Is this just us? Is there something going on here? So that kind of sparked what I did for this research. So again, I'll let my little agenda slide there pop up. And for those of you, the backgrounds of my slides are some of the various buildings that I've been at here at IUP throughout my time. Some of them no longer exist, including the one you're looking at right now, which was Scranton Hall. It was part of Scranton and Lawrence together. It was our governor's quad. But focusing back on that, I want to kind of walk you through what my dissertation research was and some of the things that I found based on that. I want to talk about some of the terms I'm going to be using real quick. I think most of us are familiar with those, but just in case there's some people who are a little newer to the profession, or just so that way we're working from a common Definition, obviously, housing and residence life professionals are those who perform various functions such as staff supervision, student development programming, facilities management, administrative functions in student housing at institutions of higher education. Live-in staff, obviously, staff members who reside in the facility they supervise. The residents, it's typically an apartment or some other thing located in a residence hall. Residents of the building likely know the location of that apartment. There's a little less separation between the work and the home environment. And the employer can provide things such as furnishings, utilities, amenities for those spaces. Live on is kind of a half step away from that, is the best way I can describe that, where the person doesn't reside in the facility where they're responsible for, but they live in a facility owned by the institution. So it could be an apartment, a house, a townhouse, similar type of residence, but there's some separation between that work environment and that home environment. So the two are not one and the same. Obviously, live off, the individual doesn't live on campus, they rent something off campus, they have a house in town, they have a house nearby, etc. And again, this is the most separated from the work environment, but is usually also, again, the employer typically doesn't provide anything help-wise, assistance-wise for that. Traditional contracts, just so that we're using the same language here, this is sort of that at-will type. There's no set number of years, so there's not a, this position is renewable for 3 years, this position has a 5-year term limit, etc. These are what were described as what folks would call saying having a good job. But as we come into the 21st century, in the beginning of this century, that's starting to come into the question. And honestly, most of the research on jobs and commitment and whatnot come from the framework of a traditional employment. The term limited, or sometimes it's referred to as contingent, again, these are your folks that are stated it's as renewable, it's not to exceed 3 or 5 years, and there's usually no employment in this position after the end of the term, regardless of the performance. So in other words, this person could be one of your best employees, but if you don't have a position higher up that you can move them in, or there's not something else at the institution, or the term has just run out, but they're a really good employee, they move on because that is what the contract says. So if we look at a little bit of the background concerning housing and residence life professionals and their turnover rates, the research, at least the prior research that I found, the figures were all over the place. I saw as low as 30%, as high as 60% for professionals who are in their first 5 years of their first 5 years in the profession, depending on the study again. And that could be for a variety of reasons, again, because of the contract, because they burn out, various reasons. But these rates seem to have been steady over a 40-year period. So looking back into the 80s up through this study was conducted in 2019 and 2020. So right there is where these rates are coming from. And again, it occurs for several reasons. It's also interesting to point out that 50% of the positions that tend to be posted are positions in housing and residence life. They're the entry-level positions that are posted on conference websites. So like your TPE, your higher ed jobs, your student affairs, about 50% of those are entry-level positions. So you're getting a variety of people. You're getting people who want to work in housing and residence life. You're getting people who, they maybe want to work, and you're getting people who, well, I'm taking this because I want to use the student affairs degree I just earned. And I'm using this to get some experience and then move on to the job that I really want. Economically, the wages in these type of positions tend to be lower. Again, this comes from some information from 2017 from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Individuals with a master's degree in the ages of 25 to 34, their median salary with a master's is about $65,000, whereas if you look at ACUHO-I's own data from 2018, the average salary for a housing and residence life professional who lives in, which typically requires a master's degree, is about $37,000. So there's a gap there between the expected salaries or the anticipated median salaries and the actual median salary for housing and residence life professionals. Quality of life can also be an issue too. Again, how many of us have heard this isn't just a job, it's a lifestyle? I know my supervisors and folks that I've met have said that in the past, and I definitely believe that myself. Having lived it for how many years, it was a definite, for lack of a better term, shock to the system when I transitioned from on campus to off campus. When I transitioned from housing and residence life to career services, it was a huge change. Sometimes there's longer hours. The on-call work is sometimes an issue for folks in quality of life. There's that fishbowl effect where it can be difficult to work where you live. You know, there's a lack of privacy. You've got eyes on you. And again, that work-life integration, it brings up issues for people, especially when they have partners and they start to incorporate children into those relationships. The lifestyle of a live-in, live-on housing and residence life professional can become, less appealing as we move forward. Now, I referenced this 5-year-and-out norm earlier, and I think, and it was very timely that the talking stick talked about this back in 2018, because this was right as I was pulling together some of my research and starting to formulate things. They had an article that discussed with several individuals the 5-year-and-out sort of norm. And the thing that I found interesting was none of those people that they were talking to in that discussion could say where it came from. It was just something that was there. It had always been there. It's typically more memorialized in a contract for those that have it, but even when it's not, there seems to be a pressure or a cultural norm of supervisors saying, hey, you've been here now for several years now. Where are you going? Have you thought about what your next step are in that 3 to 5 year time range? So even when there's not a stated endpoint, there is that, for lack of a better term, norm or a pressure there, whether it's stated or unstated. So the graphic I've seen, and this is something that I've noticed in research, especially in housing and residence life concerning our entry level and our live-in staff, turnover is a problem. Folks have said, various folks throughout the time have said turnover is a problem, but these term limits exist. And the term limits cause turnover. But the term limits exist, so they must work, or in my experience, they must have some sort of function, but then turnover is problematic. So there's this cycle that appears to have repeated itself for many years, but there's little research, if any, to show, is this good for the profession? Is this good for the people who are in the profession? Is this good for institutions? Like, there is very little there. And I think the COVID issues that we've had and the great resignation that we've had have only, amplified some of these issues to kind of say, is this a good thing? Is this something that will continue to sustain this career path? Now, my theoretical foundations, and again, I know with this group, I don't want to get uber theoretical, because again, this is coming from my dissertation defense as well, but I do want to at least make mention of the lenses that I use to come up with my survey model and my other models here. So the first thing is the 3-component model of commitment. And what the 3-component model of commitment is, it's from Mayer and Allen, their 1997 version, but it's also been revised a few times to make some small tweaks, but the overarching concepts have changed, where it's one of the most widely used models of organizational commitment. And there's basically 3 elements to it. You have an effective commitment, which is basically, your heart, the wanting to be in a career. The organization evokes positive feelings and you have a fondness for that organization. And high effective commitment, it can buffer some of the negative effects of a working condition that may occur in housing and residence life. So, hey, my job isn't the best at times, but I love what I do. I love the organization I work for. And employees with high levels of effective commitment are typically less likely to leave an organization. Now, continuous commitment is that sort of purse string, for lack of a better term, that I need to do this job because I got to eat, I got to live, I got bills to pay. So I do it because of those situations. So it's the economic reasons why people commit to a position. And basically what our employees are doing, and this is heavily apparent during the Great Resignation, they're taking a look at the cost benefit analysis and saying, I get paid X at this location and these kind of benefits. I can go down the street, get double the money, and deal with half of the issues. Why am I still doing the role that I'm currently in? It tends to definitely be a less powerful reason to commit to an organization. Typically, your people who are continually committed, that economic thing will only keep them for so long before the other areas and other things will pull them away. It tends to be negatively linked to turnover intention. If I leave, I lose my investment in the organization, is basically how folks will look at that. And again, the microeconomics, and we're seeing that very clearly with the Great Resignation, impact this area of organization commitment and lower the threshold for people to say, hey, the grass is greener over there. I'm out. Normative commitment, this is a moral obligation. I try to describe this one as, I do it because I believe it's the right thing to do. I'm committed because I want to avoid feeling guilty that I'm not doing the right thing. This usually forms through socialization with the organization. So, the goals, the value statements, and does the organization actually live up to those espoused goals that are out there? And this is kind of where that sense of self-worth in a position comes from. But unfortunately, this tends to also be a very weak area of the 3 areas of commitment where, yes, I value doing the right thing, but if I don't like it and it's not economically beneficial to me, doesn't matter if it's the right thing to do or not. A couple other theories that I pulled from too, expectancy theory from Vroom and Pidner, where employees, they come in with a certain set of assumptions about the employment and about the organization. All that information that we send to folks about, this is what our organization's like, and this is what you're going to get paid, and this is what our students are like, and this is what our team is like. If those items meet or exceed an individual's expectations, they're more likely to continue to commit to an organization. But if there starts to be an incongruence in that expectancy, then there can be issues again with that person wanting to be like, well, yeah, they talk a good game, but I don't see it. Where is it? This is not the organization I expected to join. Job satisfaction, again, your state of mind concerning your job experience. Again, there is a strong negative relationship between turnover and satisfaction, meaning that if you're less satisfied, you're going to turn over. And vice versa. If you're really satisfied, you're going to stick with that organization. And things, this is an area where it can lead, that satisfaction point can lead to the next thing that I have on there, job stress, where, there's positive benefits to a certain level of stress, where, it can be healthy, it can increase motivation, connection, but many of us, I'm sure, have experienced some of the negative side of that job stress, where it leads to, physical issues, high blood pressure, fatigue, headaches, psychological issues, anxiety, depression, anger. So all of this together and combined with the research on contract type, which there are very few studies that compare traditional to contingent contracts, even just in the business world, where you might have folks who are on call or seasonal employees or whatnot. So there's very few there that are, it's mixed and it's conflicting regarding job satisfaction of those individuals. There's no clear-cut answer one way or the other. And there are definitely methodological issues there with those types of things, such as inconsistent definitions, educational sectors being excluded, and definitely our sector being excluded. So we look at the research questions that I looked at real quick. Again, I wanted to look at how do turnover intentions vary when considering different employment contracts. How does the organizational environment contribute to turnover intentions? How do expectations contribute? And then how do the individual's employee characteristics, who they are, how does that work to their turnover intentions? So I had several hypotheses, and I'll let those come up again. My hypotheses at this point, considering there was little research in this area, were that I was going to at least even find a variation, let alone trying to predict the direction of that variation, but that there will even be something there. So my methodology, this was a quantitative study, sent out a survey with the help of ACUHO-I, also on my own. I also advertised this through Facebook, through some groups, which I know some of you also found this webinar through those groups. So I appreciate it if you took part in my study or if you encouraged others to do so. But I had sent that in 2 waves. I started with the Facebook groups, and then my chair had advised me that we want to make sure we have as broad enough of a grouping as possible. So you said, Bill, you said ACUHO-I might be able to help you with that. So investigated it, and then we had it also sent through ACUHO-I. Created a survey. The survey, I will say this, it was a little long because it was covering topics such as contract type, where folks lived and the conditions thereof. Used some existing scales in there. I used the three-component model employee commitment survey, the job satisfaction survey, and the Copenhagen burnout inventory. And all of those are publicly available in free instruments, which was a nice plus considering I'm a poor graduate student, or was a poor graduate student. Well, anyway. Also asked about employee expectations, the organization characteristics, compensation, questions about turnover intention, and then their personal demographics. Once I had the data, I was able to conduct an OLS regression on the data. So let's talk about what I found. Pardon me there. I had an initial response of 288. But unfortunately, I had to filter several of those individuals out for various reasons. 38 were not full-time or identified themselves as graduate students, and I really wanted full-time professionals in that grouping. So we lost 38 there. I lost another 71 for folks who didn't reply to enough of the survey, and that was likely due to the length. So that left me a sample of 174, which is a decent sample for this kind of work. Conducted a factor analysis to confirm the reliability and validity of the data and that it conformed with the instruments, and it did. I didn't find any issues with reliability or validity, especially given some of the things that I pulled from. And then finally, what I did was conducted regressions on 4 different types of turnover. So I came up with models of same position, remaining in student affairs, remaining in higher education, and then remaining at the same institution, but not necessarily in the same position. And I did that both with and without controls. Some notable characteristics of my sample. The one thing, and I was actually talking to Tori about this prior to starting up, I didn't find a great deal of people who had term limited contracts. Almost 82% of my sample had traditional contracts, which I thought in and of itself was interesting, considering my own observations of the number of positions I see that say this position is term limited to blah, 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 as well as that ACUHO-I article. So that in and of itself kind of said something to me. Some other key things there, our sample size, we're dealing with small to mid-sized institutions, mostly with this sample, mostly public institutions. A great deal, though, with fewer than 750 residents. Not a lot of people were supervising grad or pro staff, so this was, again, a predominantly what I would consider entry-level positions. Most folks working between 40 and 54 hours, having about a week or so on call, depending on, I'm assuming the time of year there, getting at least a couple weeks, if not more, off as paid days off. Primarily female, primarily a little younger, overwhelmingly white, which again does cause some issues if we look at trying to say something about non-white individuals. Having a partner, no kids, and then master's degrees, and again, many of them had under 5 years with the organization. So my hypothesis testing, when we took a look at my hypotheses, after the OLS regression, after everything came through, one of the key things I found is that no single hypothesis was accepted across all 4 levels. And what I mean by accepted, it had to at least have a probability statistic or a p-value of 0.05 or higher, meaning that for anything that's accepted, the likelihood of that particular element at least contributing to the cause of remaining in a position, remaining in student affairs, remaining in higher ed, or remaining at the current institution is at least 95% or greater. And you can see from this graphic here that the most hypotheses were accepted with folks remaining at their current position and remaining in their current institution. And in some ways that makes sense. It makes sense if you're going to be committed to a position, you're obviously going to want to stay in that position, and then you're obviously going to want to stay at that institution. So when looking at some of the significant elements in turnover, when we broke down those regression equations and dug a little deeper, I found that for folks remaining in the same position and remaining at the same institution, we had some commonalities, and those mostly dealt with normative and continuous commitment. And that was something I was kind of surprised to find, considering that in the previous research, effective commitment is usually the strongest thing that keeps folks at a position. But based on the models that I ran, it seems as if normative and continuous commitment are have more strength and have more power in keeping folks at their current institution and in their same position. Whereas if we look at folks who want to just remain in student affairs and remain in higher education, client-related burnout, which I reframed for the purposes of my survey as student-related burnout, and then identifying as white and having children were the most common elements to those two models. So exploring that and looking at the data that I had, I came up with two separate models. One, positional or institutional commitment, which basically was comprised of normative commitment and continuous commitment feeding into being committed to staying at the institution. So in other words, that would say that, folks appear to be driven by the culture and the norms of the institution and economics. Whereas the career committed folks, the things that showed up were having children, being white, and client-related burnout. So what explained career commitment were those three factors. Now, I know I mentioned it previously, but there were definitely some limitations to this study. Obviously, low numbers identifying with certain variables. Again, I had very low numbers of individuals with term limited contracts, low numbers of non-white individuals, and a larger sample might generate different results based upon that. If I had a much larger nationally based sample and more participation nationwide. Other things, the item phrasing, individuals could have misread, misinterpreted some of the questions. There were also some things in the expectations variable that could have been broken down a little bit further. So this may have, but that would have definitely impacted the overall length, which was already an issue of this survey. Items that I could have asked about but didn't, concerning tenure in the profession and what level the position were left off. So I didn't ask those questions, and perhaps I should have. And then finally, the one big thing was the timing of this study. COVID-19 hit just before I launched these surveys. I know my own campus, we shut down just about mid-March of 2020. And I know several campuses around the country also did the same. So with that, funding was restricted, less positions were available, there were layoffs, the nature of the positions changed. So that repeating this study now, repeating this study 5 years ago, I would expect to see potentially different results. If I didn't, then there may be something to say about that as well. But this is essentially a study that was done right at the beginning of COVID, which also then can say some things to us about the early impact of COVID-19 on housing and residence life professionals. For future research, again, if I were to do this, or if somebody else were to take this forward, I would, again, replicate it with a much larger sample. I'd also maybe cut down on the number of variables, some things that I initially saw that were insignificant. We would probably discard those at this point. Maybe cut it down to just commitment, stress, and satisfaction. Do some definite interaction analysis, because there's likely some interaction going on between some of these variables, which may help have better explanatory power overall if we did some further interaction analyses. Looking at the topic of career versus organizational commitment. because they are two different concepts. So looking at those and looking at it in more detail. Finally, are there links between student retention and professional retention? If those exist, do they correspond to each other? So that's one thing that, research like this could then say, well, if we have committed and well-retained housing and residence life professionals, so what? What does that lead to? Can we link this research to student retention, which is a big topic on many of our campuses? Learning more about the whys of retention, maybe a more qualitative study about, for the folks who do stay, why is it? Are the triangulating what we're seeing from the survey with actual data, qualitative data? And then finally, more about the messages about that organizations communicate to professionals and how the professionals receive those messages, and does it have an impact on their turnover retention? So the socialization, the work-life integration messages. So when looking at this and recommendations for practice, for the professionals themselves, consider where you work, consider what it is you want in a position, and practice what you preach. If you're telling your students, hey, take time off, hey, take care of yourself, you also need to remember to do that for yourself. It's that whole, the lifeguard cannot save themselves if they're drowning. So make sure that you're taking care of yourselves and really practicing what we preach. For organizations and institutions, the question comes down, or at least is, there may be a conversation to be had about, do we replace people or do we retain people? What's the cost benefit of doing one versus the other? Because there's a cost to recruitment, there's a cost to retaining people. And, given in many of our areas, falling enrollments, upcoming demographic issues, some organizations are going to need to start making some tough decisions on quality versus quantity. This ideal worker myth, as it's sometimes referred to in the literature, where there's a right way to be a student affairs professional. There are certain, you have to pay your dues kind of deal. Our younger workers appear to be a little less tolerant of some of those perceived norms. So our organizations might need to be careful how they proceed to make sure that they're getting quality candidates and individuals that are going to want to work and be able to work in positions that are definitely at times very stressful. And, as I've seen in the readings, and I'm sure as many of you had, that sometimes provide little prestige, that the economic benefits are questionable relative to the degree, and that sometimes provide not ideal work-life integration. And that the more candid our organizations are with our future professionals, they're more likely to find better fits for positions. Theoretically, more salary might not be a fix. One of the things that at least my survey pointed out was that salary wasn't necessarily, just pay them more and they'll stay. Well, maybe they won't. Maybe we need to look at conditions. Raising salary could eventually could be even perceived as throwing good money after bad. Now, again, I couch that into when the survey was taken versus right now, pardon me, that sentiment may have changed. So it's a consideration to think about. And then, is it a calling to the organization, to a position, or to the career? Are folks being called to a particular organization, especially given the length of normative commitment and turnover intention? Or are they being called to a particular organization, but they're okay changing positions? Or is it a particular career that they're being called to? At this point, my formal remarks, my formal presentation is done, but if folks have any questions, again, I'll answer what I can.
So far, there are no questions in the chat, so can open it up to those who are here for any questions you might have.
I can start. Quick question for you out of curiosity. So I think it looks like in the survey, it kind of worked out that you didn't have a lot of information about the impacts of specifically term limits. We're an institution that does not. I know it's an institution that do. Every so often someone brings it up and we have the conversation around it. In your mind, like just wax eloquently for a second on anything you did discover or were curious about or have thoughts on that.
Yeah, on at least on term limits, again, my thought is why push, because there's a certain segment of the population, I'm sure of it, that would be perfectly happy being a live-in, live-on residence life professional for many years. You know, there are certain people, I myself have experienced it personally, and it was part of the impetus, Rob, and the reason of doing this study was I saw colleagues of mine in the state system of higher education, and we may be a unicorn amongst others, or this may be a dying era, if you will. But I knew folks here in Pennsylvania who were live-in, live-on residence life professionals for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And then I also knew of the folks who had the term limits. And even I myself had a previous supervisor at one point tell me, if you're here longer than 3 years, there's a problem. And number one, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But number two, I'm like, why? Why is it a problem? Why push effective people out who are willing to do the kind of work that we need them to do in residence halls, who are obviously love the institution, love the organization, and may not want to or be willing to move up the chain, if you will. You know, I think we need to take a hard look at ourselves and be like, yeah, our organizations are pyramidal in structure. There's a lot of people at the bottom, and as you continue to rise, there's not a lot of people at the top. So for the folks who like it, who are okay with the economics, who are okay with the lifestyle, and who seem to like what they do, why should we continue, or why I would question why the institutions, and again, I'm sure there's reasons. I'm sure, you know, burnout is probably one of them. But the fact that when I came across my research, directors of housing and residence life tend to be 10 years younger than their peers. They tend to rise quickly and have a lot less experience. Well, part of that is this whole mythos around the 5 and out. And I think what I'm trying to say, or at least was trying to put out there, was it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, when I go back to, let me find the slide here. Give me a second. When I go back to this right here and seeing that almost 82% of the folks who I surveyed didn't have a traditional contract. Now, again, without asking what their level of employment was, I don't know for sure if that's all entry level, or if there's, you know, a larger group of folks who were upper level but live on in there, you know, senior level, mid-level, who were live on. So I think that's, I was ultimately surprised, Rob, at how few term limited contracts, because I thought I'd find more and I didn't. So maybe it's not as much of a problem, but even if there isn't the formalized one, there's definitely still that informal pressure there. I hope I answered. Let me know if I can clarify, or if you.
You did great. Thanks. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. So I think I agree 100%. There is even if unwritten, there are unwritten rules about if you are someone who's like, I like the job I'm doing, I kind of want to stick here. You still get, you answer on a regular basis the what do you want to do next type thing. So
Yep.
actually, for my own edification, while you're at it, can you
Sure.
slide back to the slide that was the organizational and the factors for them, and
Sure.
the career and the factors for them? I just thought that slide was interesting. I just love to
Absolutely.
steal a screenshot and use that in my thinking.
Yeah, let me get it to the single screen if I can here too. PowerPoint and I have been having an argument. It doesn't want to work for me.
The recording will be posted on our YouTube channel once we get it processed. So if you want to come back and look at it later too, it'll be there.
It's all right. Yeah, don't worry about it. I'll look
Okay,
at it on the
yeah,
recording.
you'll
Thank you
get
very
it.
much.
But you're welcome.
Any other questions from those of you who are here?
And again, we've had some delays. My full dissertation will be out in the Indiana University of Pennsylvania ProQuest, so it will be out there.
All right. Looks like there's no more questions. So I'll thank those of you who are here, and thank you, Bill, for presenting today and sharing your dissertation work with us.
No, thank you all, especially thanks to ACUHO-I for allowing me to distribute the survey through. It definitely helped with the increasing the numbers. I think I almost doubled my response rate just from having those emails go out. So it was very much appreciated. And again, I thank everybody for attending, and please share with your colleagues.